Welcome to another program in our series, Candidate Forum. I'm Bill Weir, the producer and host, and I'm delighted to have with me today Paul Thissen.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you are making a good campaign for governor of our state.
I think so. It feels really good. We're getting a great response.
And what kind of background did you have early in life to make this attempt to become our governor?
Well, I am from Minnesota. I grew up in Bloomington. My folks were both public school teachers.
Well, that's a good start.
It is a good start, and you know they were. I've been very lucky in my life with regard to lots of things. But I'm a lawyer in my other career, and I do healthcare law and work especially with people trying to deal with the long-term care system. And so I have a lot of new insights into that. But in that role, as a lawyer, I did a lot of pro bono work, a lot of work for people that needed services for free. We started an organization called Access for People with Disabilities when I saw that the criminal justice system and the justice system in general was not as accessible and understandable to people with disabilities as to others. And so we trained up a number of lawyers to help represent those folks through the process.
That's important.
It is really important.
And
yeah.
I'm getting old myself. I may need your services sometime.
There you go.
Or one of them that you've trained.
Yeah, no, that was a really successful program. And then I've also handled death penalty cases. We had a case down in Texas that took 10 years, but we freed a guy that was wrongly sentenced, and he's now a minister serving a lot of people down in Texas, which is a great story of redemption, I think. And
oh yes,
gives more insight into the criminal justice system that always doesn't live up to the word justice, right?
Right.
And these days I do a lot of pro bono work helping people seeking refugee asylum here in the United States. Clearly a big issue that's going on across the country as well. But
I'm an immigrant, by the way.
Is that right? I didn't know
from
that.
Canada.
There you go. I didn't know that. Wow.
And but go on. What?
Oh yeah. Well, so my family, my wife and I, we have 3 kids. We have a first year in college, and then 2 boys who are sophomore and freshman in high school. And I've served in the legislature for 15 years, representing Richfield and now South Minneapolis, and which has been a tremendous experience, and served in a lot of roles there, including leader of the Democrats for 6 years and Speaker of the House, when we had, I think, the most productive, progressive legislative session probably in a couple generations. And so I'm really looking forward to kind of getting to know Minnesota more and more, and letting them get to know me more and more. But so far, we've had a really great response.
Great, good for you.
Yeah.
So outside of the metro area, some of the concerns of the citizens.
Well, no, I've spent a lot of time over the last decade in particular traveling all across the state and getting to know the nuances of these different communities, and working with those communities to pass important legislation through the state house, and working with their representatives as the leader of the Democrats. And so it's been a great, I've learned a lot about the state, and the amazing thing is how many really unbelievable people there are out there trying to solve problems in their own communities. A lot of great energy.
That's why I moved to this state.
Is that right?
Yeah, I saw the people, after several visits to the Twin Cities, I discovered these are people that look to how to solve problems, not just bemoaning them.
Yeah, I think that's a very big Minnesota trait, and it's made us really a great state.
So why are you running for governor?
Well, really, that is one of the reasons. I think one of the things I can bring to the office of governor is someone with a pretty bold, progressive vision about where we need to go, but also someone who's proven time and again that you can actually get it done, working with people to accomplish those things. And so I think that combination, especially in this time of gridlock and kind of political chaos, someone that can come in and say, not only do I have these great ideas, but we can get them done together. And I know we can get them done because I've done it before. I think is a powerful message. But the 3 things that I really want to focus on, one is just the basic economic insecurity and lack of peace of mind a lot of families are feeling. Around healthcare costs, whether they'll be able to see a doctor or nurse without bankrupting themselves, and childcare costs, whether they can find affordable childcare to get to work and make sure their kids are safe, affording higher education, retirement security. Those are the things that I hear about from Minnesotans. And I've done a lot of work in the legislature to try to address, and I think as governor, that's where my primary focus is going to be. The second thing is we're the second most unequal state in the country. We've been ranked that. And for Minnesotans, I think that hits pretty close to home. On racial disparities. Yeah. And across the board, jobs and schools and healthcare, criminal justice. In all of those areas, we just don't perform very well in terms of the equity we have between, the general population and communities of color and indigenous people. And we need to do a much better job of that. So if there's really any legacy I'd love to leave, after I leave the governor's office that Minnesota's accomplished, it would be to move us from the second most unequal state to being a state that truly is kind of living up to the promise of equal opportunity for everybody. And the last thing is, I do notice, even though there's a lot of great energy out there around kind of politics and resistance, there's still way too many people that feel disconnected from their government and feel like they don't have a voice in this democracy. And I think that's a really dangerous thing. And one of the things I've always tried to do in my legislative work, and frankly, one of the only ways that I've seen success in the political world, is when we bring energy from outside the Capitol, engage people, and bring them into the process to make change happen. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. I mean, the clearest example of that for me was the marriage equality vote. When I was speaker, probably the proudest moment of my legislative career. And when we passed marriage equality. And when we did that, I choked up, and a lot of it had to do, when I was gaveling down the vote, and a lot of it had to do with looking at some really amazing legislators who took a vote that they knew could risk their political careers, but took it anyway because they knew it was the right thing to do. And we don't have that kind of political courage the way we need in this country. And the second thing was, outside the chamber, there were thousands of people at the Capitol that day, and every single one of them, some of their lives are going to be changed pretty fundamentally for the better.
Yes.
But every single one of them is really what made that happen. And I think that's the kind of politics that is politics at its best. And as governor, that's the kind of politics I want to build up and build upon as we try to achieve a lot more progressive victories.
And really, more justice for all.
More justice for all, right.
Where we're lacking.
That's exactly right.
So do you want to go into more detail on what we can do about addressing healthcare costs?
Sure, yeah. It's the number one issue I hear about as I travel around the state. People are really concerned about it. And I think, the first step, I don't know, the ultimate direction I think we needed to go on the payment side and to kind of give people affordable access is to move toward a single payer system. I do think that is, and it's kind of a basic Minnesota value from my perspective. Right now I'm pretty healthy, thankfully, and I'm willing to pay a little bit more for folks that need help, that are sicker than me, because I know someday I'm going to be there, and there's going to be people coming behind me to help me out, right? And if we start our discussion, I think, from that value system of kind of being in it all together, I think we're going to we'll get to a better healthcare system. But there's other things we need to do. We need to focus on how we deliver care and be more creative about that and more holistic about that. Having doctors and nurses working together, right? But with mental health experts and with social service folks, so we can support people in staying healthy. And that's the third thing that I think, we made some really big strides over the last decade in terms of public health in this state. But those kind of efforts to help people, deal with obesity, reduce smoking, have a healthy life can have a huge impact. And the state can really be a partner and has been successfully a partner. But we need to continue to make those investments. And the last thing I think is, right here in Minnesota, we can do some, could be a research and development in Silicon Valley of healthcare, right? And we already are, but we could build on that, solve Alzheimer's.
We have a wealth of healthcare capacity here.
We absolutely do. And some amazing institutions, some amazing thinkers, and really a healthcare community. The one thing that's always struck me is our healthcare community, not just in government, but the whole healthcare community, more than any other state, I think, really does think about the common good and work together to improve the health of Minnesotans. And I think that's something we can build on.
Yes. So important to build on that. And it's only recently that we've allowed for-profit hospitals, isn't it? Is that true?
For-profit insurance companies, yes, to serve Minnesota in the HMO space.
Oh,
yeah. We do have a few for-profit hospitals, but most of them remain nonprofit as well. But we are, that was the wrong direction for us to go, to bring more of that profit motive into healthcare. It doesn't serve our people that well.
Yeah. Well, how about you sharing some ideas about early childhood education?
Yeah. Well, see, this is one of my my biggest passions, and because I think it can make such a huge impact on the future, right? I mean,
Yes, I've seen evidence of that.
Yes. So we have had some good success kind of starting in 2013 when I became speaker. Those 2 years, we passed all-day kindergarten for the first time in the state. Now 99% of 5-year-olds get the access to all-day, everyday kindergarten without having to pay for it. And we passed the first real meaningful investment in 3- and 4-year-old education. We need to continue to expand on that, and I think we can do that. There's some good bipartisan support around that. But I also think we need to think about children's health care, which is a huge passion of mine, and making sure that especially young kids can see a doctor and nurse when they need to and get the kind of mental health screenings and other health screenings that they need to, so critical to their success.
And I think we need some federal action on that too.
Well, the CHIP has to, I mean, that is outrageous that they haven't done that. But, you know, getting stable housing for young kids is really critically important. Making sure that we have child protection services that keep kids safe. You know, we are struggling with that in the state, and we need to pay more attention to that. And the last thing that I think we have to do a lot better job is what I talk about is the first 1,000 days. You know, those earliest years are really when the brain development happens so much, and we don't do enough to support families in those earliest years to understand, you know, what you should be doing, how best to care, and take some of the stress off the family so the child doesn't experience the trauma that can be really, really devastating to development.
Yeah, for example, if your parents are really coming down hard on your brother and sister, that's a bad lesson.
It is
for an infant and toddler, and inspiring a lot of fear instead of the focus on exploring the world.
That's exactly right, and it's a huge issue.
So should we get into transportation?
Sure.
What's your plan?
Well, I mean, this is something that is kind of the biggest unfinished business, I think, in the state. You know, we are falling behind. And to me, you know, part of it is just kind of an embarrassment for this generation, in a sense. You know, my parents' generation, my grandparents, they made the kind of investments in infrastructure that made this state. And this generation has not stepped up and not been willing to make those investments in the common good. So, you know, roads and bridges, you know, we have a significant underinvestment right now that we need to catch up on. I do support a gas tax to help pay for that. It's a user fee, and I think it makes good sense. Transit, we need to do a lot more, you know, and that's a thing that cuts across this across the state. I was talking to a friend of mine up in Long Prairie, Minnesota, you know, so kind of up north. And he was saying, well, we were joking. I said I put 200,000 miles on my car, right? My Ford, kind of doing a lot of campaign travel and other travel around the state. And he said, well, that's nothing. I put 500,000 miles on mine. And the reason that he did it, the reason he's gotten those miles is because three times a week, he drives 3 times a day from Long Prairie to Little Falls and from Long Prairie to Alexandria, taking people to their dialysis appointments. You know, this is the transit system that exists in Greater Minnesota. We can do better than that. We shouldn't have to be relying, you know, on Mr. Parrish, who does a great job, but we shouldn't have to be relying on that and putting such a burden on him. We should have a transit system that can move people across the state in every part of the state. And if we think about it from that perspective, I think we can break through some of the political gridlock and really get this done.
Yeah. Well, I've worked on that with the disabled American veterans, providing them rides to the hospital and so on in near Bloomington.
Yep.
And it really meant a lot to them to have the ease of getting there. And if we have an adequate transportation system, metro mobility might serve some of the people here in the Twin Cities.
It doesn't serve everybody, and it's severely underfunded right now. We have a big challenge there.
So you've heard a lot about childcare costs and affordable housing. What can we do with those two problems?
Yeah, I mean, these are the two issues: childcare costs and affordable housing. That, you know, every campaign year you hear kind of new issues pop up, and these have been, you know, clearly issues that have been under the surface for a long time, but they're really things that people are talking about a lot. You know, childcare, you travel around the state, you hear about the challenges of, you know, the cost of it, but in many parts of the state it doesn't even exist. And where I hear from it most is not even the families, it's the businesses who can't find their workforce. You know, we have this workforce shortage, and one of the places that they see to solve that is actually to get more affordable childcare in these communities, because then those parents can actually go to work. and they want to go to work, but they're held back. Wadena, Minnesota, short 500 slots of childcare in that region.
Wow.
Austin, Minnesota, short about 800 slots. If we could free up half of those, just think what that would mean for economic development, for workforce, and for the good of those families. And housing is the same thing. They can't attract enough workers because there's not enough affordable housing in these communities. So on both, and then in the Twin Cities, we're seeing people, so many communities priced out of their homes because rents are going up and up and up, and we really need to do something about that as well. So those two issues are kind of the emerging issues, it feels like, in this campaign, and come back to that central thing that I think is so important, which is we really need to be fighting and focusing on the economic security of Minnesota families. And if we do that, these are the kind of things we need to solve.
Well, and now, one of the issues I've been hearing about is the horrible situation of some students getting deep in debt, and there's no way to discharge it. It's on your back all the time.
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of those issues I hear about everywhere I go, and it's a challenge. I had coffee with a couple of teachers, school teachers, public school teachers, a while ago. And we were talking about schools, but then we started talking about kind of their lives in general. And one of the things that and one of them actually started crying because she said, I have this job and I love to teach and I get a decent wage, but I'm thinking of having a family. And when I think about the childcare costs that I have to cover, and then I think about the student debt payments that I have to make, it's overwhelming. And I think a lot of families are in that situation, a lot of new recent graduates, and particularly folks that have graduated since the last recession. This is a very, very serious issue. And, we've made some significant investment. We put $250 million in, and when I was Speaker of the House, into higher education to freeze tuitions. But for that debt that people have incurred in the past, what I think we need to do is do something we did similar to what we did with the Affordable Care Act, where we basically said, you don't have to pay more than a certain percentage of your income in terms of paying back student loans, and we'll pick up the rest. And to really help those families get there, and those students get their start in life, be able to own a home, be able to get the kind of productive job that they want, invest, and get a car, make these kind of investments in their future and start saving for their own kids' education and their own retirement. So this is something that we need to tackle, and I think we need to be pretty bold about how we think about it.
Now, what distinguishes your campaign from all the other gubernatorial candidates?
Yeah, I mean, we have a really strong field, and I think on the Democratic side, and I think Minnesota's very lucky to have that kind of a strong field.
Yes.
I think the thing that distinguishes me and our campaign is really two things. The first thing, and we've talked a little bit about it, is the fact that not only do I have some ideas that I'm talking about and that I want to achieve, but I have the record, the credibility of actually having done it. There's nobody in the race that has actually kind of stood toe-to-toe with the Republicans and some of their bad ideas to undermine environmental regulations, to do bad tax cuts, to disinvest in our most vulnerable people, and that I've done. And I've also, more importantly, stepped up and delivered. On some pretty tough and controversial things. I mean, marriage equality we talked about already, but when I was Speaker, we did all-day kindergarten, and we did the first investment in early childhood education, as we talked about before. We raised the minimum wage. We did the Women's Economic Security Act that was about equal pay for equal work. We did a solar standard in the state, the first time nation leading that actually made this what's happening now in the solar energy industry, the explosion across the state. I mean, that really kind of was the groundwork that led to that. We passed the DREAM Act for Minnesota. We banned the box to make sure that people that had felonies on their record could actually at least get a foot in the door to get employment after they leave.
At least get an interview.
Get an interview. That's exactly right. So, so all of these things were tough. They were controversial, but we led our caucus to get through them, and we got them done for Minnesotans. And I think, with all the cynicism that's out there, I think people are really thirsty for that kind of leadership that's about rolling up your sleeves and getting stuff done. And I think more than anybody in the race, I can talk about that and prove that because I've been there and done that.
Well, what are the biggest challenges that facing the state that you might be able to lead on solving? Well,
I think the economic security issues we've been talking about are one of those. Certainly, this this racial disparities gap that we have in the state is
Yeah.
going to be something that holds us back. And the last thing, which is not just the state of Minnesota, but is hugely problematic, is the environmental change, climate change, and what we
Yeah.
can do to take that on. And the good news there, I think, is that because Minnesota has taken steps like the solar energy standard or the renewable energy standard a decade ago that I helped lead on and get done, those things have actually moved, so the marketplace is kind of driving our, at least Minnesota, energy system much more toward renewables. And I think that's really exciting, and we just have to keep the pressure on.
Well, good. Do you want to say more about the racial disparities?
Yeah, I mean, this really is something that is at the heart of why one of the things that I really want to tackle as the next governor. And there's a lot of things we can do. There's a program called the Northside Achievement Zone in Minneapolis, and these promise neighborhoods that are growing up around the state that I've been a real champion of at the legislature. I think they're doing great stuff. I mean, they're basically saying every child born in this community is going to go to college. And they're starting with that premise, and then they're figuring out, okay, what do we have to do to support the child and their family to get there? I think it's a tremendous model, and they're getting great results. So there's things I think we can do there, and lots of ideas like that. But the biggest thing to me is first we have to be willing to kind of call out the fact that there is racial discrimination and institutional racism built into some of our institutions, and be willing to acknowledge that and deal with that. And the second thing we have to do is we have to be just more intentional about how we look at every policy that comes. A lot of the problems that lead to this disparities gap come from the fact of unintended consequences of well-intentioned ideas. One of the things I've been saying and would like to do as the next governor is to not just look at the cost of bills that come across my desk, which we do, but actually really examine, okay, is this particular bill going to increase or decrease those gaps? And I think if we take that intentional approach to it, we actually can make a lot of strides in this.
I think you're right on that. There's been a lot of news in trying to solve the problem of sexual harassment and even assault.
Yeah.
And it's shown up on both sides of the aisle in the legislature. What can we do about that to make sure we don't? I guess there's no way we can make sure that we don't have it.
We can do everything we can to try to make sure that it doesn't happen, and we need to get a lot better on it. I mean, I think there are some good ideas that are emerging. A lot of it is about ensuring accountability for people and being willing to step in there. But there are a lot of ideas emerging from people. To me, the most important thing is to actually listen to kind of the survivors, and understand what their ideas are to kind of
and formulate a plan of how to deal with it.
But kind of taking their experience as the starting place for it. And I think that there's a lot of discussion right now also about affirmative consent, on campuses. I think that there's a kernel of kind of a start of the discussion there around sexual harassment too. I mean, if we get to the place where everybody has to understand that you need someone's actual consent before you do something, it starts a conversation from a different place. So I'm really looking forward to working with Representative Erin May Quaid and Lindsay Port and some of the other folks who have brought forth some of these concerns to see what their thoughts are, and working with them to make sure that we get a much better process at the legislature.
Well, Paul, we only have about 5 minutes left.
Yep.
So, do you want to talk about Donald Trump's statements on immigration that were so disturbing?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, they are kind of the approach he's taken on this issue and on refugees is incredibly disturbing. I remember after the election in 2016, my kids came home, and at that time they were a senior in high school and 8th and 9th graders. And my youngest son came home and he said, we got to school after the election and all of our friends, many of our friends, they have Muslim friends and a variety of people from in their school, they're crying. They were terrified. They were super scared. And he said, what do we do about this? And I kind of turned the question back on him and said, well, what do you think? And he said, well, the only thing I can think I can do is to make them feel as welcome at our school as possible. And I think, he really hit the nail on the head
real
with that.
Compassion and even love in the best sense of the word for that.
That's what it is. And from my perspective on immigration and refugee issues, the federal government is going to fight it out. What Minnesota has to do is be as welcoming as possible to the people that are here. And I think if we take that approach, we're going to make a lot more progress.
And I hear there is evidence that immigrants, even though they go first to another state, often want to move here in order to be in the kind of environment where they're welcomed.
Yes, and and not 100% welcome. We still have issues here in Minnesota, but I think if our state takes that approach, it's going to be so good for us. One of the Republicans, Jeff Johnson, who's running for governor, wrote an essay, an opinion piece in the St. Paul Pioneer Press about saying we should stop refugees from coming to the state of Minnesota.
Really?
And I responded by saying that would just be so foolhardy because
Yes.
of our experience with this and what they mean to our economy and what they mean to the value, the quality of life here. And so we just need to be willing to stand up to people like Donald Trump and people like Jeff Johnson and say that's not the direction that Minnesota is going to go.
Yes. Now, have you talked about all the things you're proud about in your 15 years in the legislature? What is any high points?
Yeah, well, we talked about marriage equality. That was certainly a high point. The other thing that I really am proud of is the fact that my first 10 years in the legislature, and Governor Plenty was the governor, was essentially a series of deficit after deficit after deficit. We never got out of this series of deficit. And when you're living through that, you're dealing with crisis after crisis instead of planning long term. And you're also inflicting really serious kind of heartbreaking human cost on people because you're cutting child care subsidies, you're cutting health care, you're cutting retirement security and money for nursing homes. When you do that, you're not making progress. When I was speaker in 2013, we came in with our majority and working with Governor Dayton, we raised taxes on the top 2% of Minnesotans. But you know what else we did? We balanced our budget into the future. We repaid the schools. We'd borrowed $2 billion from the schools to balance our state budget. We repaid that. We built up our budget reserve. And we were able to invest in all-day kindergarten and all these other good things, in healthcare for Minnesotans, in nursing home investments. That's the kind of thing we need to do going forward. And the next governor has to have a deep awareness, I think, of understanding the implications of budget deficits versus balancing the budget in a fiscally responsible way. And I have done that, and I think that if we don't do that, we really set ourselves up for failure.
Yeah. Now, I've heard some say that experience, even in the leadership of the legislature, is not evidence that somebody can govern, because that governance of all those people in the administration.
Yeah.
What do you think you're ready for that?
I absolutely think I'm ready for that, and that's part of the reason I'm running for governor is because I think taking on that next challenge and understanding the power that agencies have in addition to the legislature to shape Minnesota's future is really profound. And again, I don't think of all the candidates running right now, anybody has kind of the depth of understanding I have of those agencies, of our state budget, of all the tools that Minnesota government can use to improve people's lives. And at the end of the day, that's really what it's all about.
Well, good. I want to thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you for having me.